At 73 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. I'd survived the Vietnam War, buried my husband of 45 years, and raised 3 children as a single mother after that. But nothing prepared me for the day I discovered that my own grandson, the boy I'd helped raise, the child I'd sacrificed everything for, was stealing from me in the most unimaginable way. The hidden camera I installed in my kitchen caught something that shattered my world completely. What I saw on that footage didn't just break my heart, it revealed a web of deception so deep that it threatened to destroy our entire family. This is the story of how trust can be weaponized, how love can be exploited, and how sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the most devastating betrayals. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Dorothy Hensley, and I live in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's the same house where I raised my children, where my late husband Frank and I built our life together, and where I plan to spend my remaining years surrounded by family memories. The white picket fence Frank painted every spring still stands, though it's showing its age now, much like myself. 3 years ago, when my daughter Rebecca's marriage fell apart, she moved back home with her 16-year-old son, Tyler. Rebecca had always been my most troubled child, the middle one who seemed to attract chaos wherever she went. Her divorce from Marcus was particularly nasty, involving accusations of infidelity, financial mismanagement, and substance abuse issues that left Tyler caught in the crossfire. I welcomed them both with open arms, grateful to have family close again after Frank's passing. The house had felt too empty, too quiet, and having Tyler's youthful energy fill those silent rooms felt like a blessing. He was a good kid, or so I thought, polite, helpful around the house, and genuinely seemed to care about his grandmother. He'd help me with groceries, mow the lawn without being asked, and spent hours listening to my stories about his grandfather. Rebecca struggled to get back on her feet. She worked double shifts at the local diner, trying to save enough money for her own place while battling what she called anxiety issues. I didn't pry too much into the details, but I noticed the pill bottles that appeared and disappeared from her purse, and the way her moods would swing dramatically from one day to the next. Still, she was my daughter, and I believed she was doing her best under difficult circumstances. Tyler seemed to be adjusting well to our small town after living in Chicago for most of his life. He made friends quickly at Cedar Falls High School, though I noticed they were an interesting mix of kids, some from good families, others who looked like they might be heading down troublesome paths. But teenagers will be teenagers, I reasoned, and I trusted that the values Rebecca and I had tried to instill in him would keep him grounded. My health had been declining steadily since Frank's death. The stress of losing him, combined with my age, had triggered a cascade of medical issues that required careful management. My doctor, Dr. Patricia Morrison, had me on a complex regimen of medications for my heart condition, diabetes, arthritis, and chronic pain from an old back injury. The pill organizer on my kitchen counter looked like a small pharmacy, filled with various medications that kept me functional and relatively comfortable. The most important of these was my heart medication, a prescription that cost nearly $400 a month even with insurance. Dr. Morrison had explained that missing even a few doses could be dangerous, potentially leading to irregular heart rhythms, or worse. I was religious about taking my medications exactly as prescribed, setting multiple alarms on my phone to ensure I never missed a dose. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when I first noticed something wasn't right. I'd gone to take my morning medications as usual, but when I opened the bottle containing my heart pills, it seemed lighter than it should have been. I counted the remaining pills carefully. There should have been 18 left until my next refill, but I only found 12. At first I assumed I'd miscounted or perhaps dropped some pills without noticing. I'm not as sharp as I used to be, and small mistakes like that weren't uncommon. I made a mental note to be more careful and went about my day. But 3 days later, when I counted again, there were only 6 pills left when there should have been 15. A cold dread began to settle in my stomach. I knew I hadn't been taking extra pills or missing doses. I was too careful about my health to make such mistakes. I started paying closer attention to my other medications and noticed similar discrepancies. My pain medication, which I took sparingly and only when absolutely necessary, was also running low faster than it should have been. I decided to mark the bottles with small pieces of tape, noting the exact count and date. Within a week, the pattern was undeniable. Someone was taking my medications. The question that haunted me was who could possibly be doing such a thing, and why. Rebecca worked long hours and was rarely home except to sleep. When she was home, she seemed exhausted and stressed, barely having energy for conversation, let alone planning any kind of theft. The idea that my own daughter might be stealing from me was too painful to seriously consider, though I couldn't completely dismiss it given her apparent struggles with anxiety and whatever medications she was taking for it. Tyler, on the other hand, was home every day after school. He had access to the kitchen where I kept my medications, and he certainly had opportunities when I was napping or running errands. But the thought of my grandson, this boy I'd watched grow up, who called me Grandma Dot with such affection, stealing my life-sustaining medications, seemed impossible. The stress of not knowing was affecting my health. I found myself lying awake at night, wondering who in my own home I couldn't trust. I started hiding my medications in different places, but they continued to disappear. Whoever was taking them knew my routines well enough to find them no matter where I put them. During this time, I began paying closer attention to Tyler's behavior. He'd always been somewhat secretive about his social life. What teenager isn't? But I started noticing patterns that troubled me. He'd receive text messages at all hours that would make him immediately leave the house, claiming he was going to study with friends or attend school activities that seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. His appearance had changed too, though so gradually I'd barely noticed until I really looked. He'd lost weight, and his eyes often had a glassy, unfocused quality that reminded me uncomfortably of how Rebecca looked during her worst periods. He'd become more irritable, snapping at innocent questions about his day or his plans, then immediately apologizing and returning to his usual charming self. Most concerning were the unexplained possessions that began appearing in his room. New clothes, expensive headphones, a high-end gaming system that he claimed he'd saved up for with money from his part-time job at the local pizza place. When I casually asked him about how much he was earning there, his answers were vague and didn't add up to the kind of money that could afford such purchases. One evening, in November, I decided to have a frank conversation with Rebecca about my concerns. She'd just returned from another double shift, looking exhausted and worn down. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd had countless important conversations with my children over the years, and I carefully explained what I'd been noticing with my medications. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and defensive. She insisted that neither she nor Tyler would ever steal from me, that I was probably just confused about my dosages or perhaps developing early signs of dementia. Her words stung, but what hurt more was the way she seemed more concerned about defending Tyler than addressing my legitimate concerns about medications that were literally keeping me alive. "Mom, you're 73 years old," she said with an exasperated sigh. "Maybe it's time to consider that you're not as sharp as you used to be. Have you talked to Dr. Morrison about memory issues?" The conversation ended badly, with Rebecca storming off to her room and refusing to discuss it further. I was left sitting alone at the kitchen table, feeling more isolated and betrayed than I had since Frank's death. The very people I'd opened my home to were dismissing my concerns and making me question my own sanity. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my neighbor Helen Kramer, who'd become something of a friend since Frank's passing. Helen was a retired nurse who'd worked in geriatric care for 30 years, and she'd seen her share of family dynamics gone wrong. "Dorothy," she said after I explained the situation, "trust your instincts. You've been managing your medications independently for years without any problems. Sudden confusion about pill counts isn't a normal part of aging, especially when you're talking about multiple medications over several weeks." Helen suggested something I'd been reluctant to consider: installing a small security camera in the kitchen to monitor who was accessing my medications. The idea of spying on my own family felt like a terrible betrayal, but the alternative, continuing to lose medications I needed to survive while being gaslit about my own mental competence, seemed worse. The next day, while Rebecca was at work and Tyler was at school, Helen helped me install a small, nearly invisible camera above the kitchen sink, with a clear view of the counter where I kept my medications. The camera was motion-activated and would send alerts to an app on my phone whenever someone entered the kitchen. Setting up that camera was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. I felt like I was crossing a line from which there might be no return, violating the trust that should exist within a family. But I also knew I couldn't continue living in uncertainty, and I couldn't afford to keep losing medications that were quite literally keeping me alive. The first few days of surveillance yielded nothing unusual. Rebecca would come through the kitchen in the morning for coffee before work, and Tyler would grab snacks after school. Normal, everyday family interactions that made me question whether I was becoming paranoid in my old age. But on Thursday evening, something changed. I was upstairs taking a bath when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the kitchen camera. Through the app, I could see Tyler entering the kitchen, but instead of going to the refrigerator or pantry as usual, he went directly to the counter where I kept my medications. What I witnessed through that camera lens would haunt me for the rest of my life. Tyler didn't just take a few pills randomly. He had a system. He carefully opened each bottle, counted out specific amounts, and transferred them to small plastic bags he pulled from his pocket. His movements were quick and practiced, suggesting this wasn't the first time he'd done this. Most devastating was watching him handle my heart medication. The pills that could mean the difference between life and death for me with the same casual efficiency he used for the others. He took nearly half of what remained in the bottle, leaving just enough that I might not notice immediately. I sat in my bathtub, water growing cold around me, watching my grandson steal medications that were keeping me alive. The boy I'd raised from a troubled childhood, who'd called me his favorite person in the world, was systematically robbing me of my health and potentially my life. But the camera captured something else that night, something that revealed this wasn't just a teenager making poor choices. After Tyler finished with my medications, he pulled out his phone and sent a text message. Within minutes, his phone rang, and I could hear his side of a conversation that chilled me to the bone. "Yeah, I got the usual stuff," he said, quietly, glancing around to make sure he was alone. "The heart pills especially, those move fast. Same price as before? Cool. I'll meet you at the usual spot in 20 minutes. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Tyler wasn't just stealing my medications for his own use. He was selling them. My grandson had turned my prescription drugs into his personal drug dealing operation, using his access to my home and his knowledge of my routines to systematically steal medications that other people were apparently willing to pay significant money for. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a desperate kid making a one-time mistake. This was a calculated, ongoing criminal enterprise. Tyler had been using my trust, my love, and my medical needs as a source of income, putting my health at risk for what appeared to be substantial profit. As I watched him leave the house through the camera, I understood that everything I thought I knew about my grandson was a lie. The polite, helpful teenager was a carefully constructed facade, hiding someone capable of stealing life-sustaining medications from his own grandmother. The expensive possessions, the frequent trips out of the house, the evasive answers about money. It all made terrible sense now. I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd had with Tyler over the past months, looking for signs I'd missed. The weight loss, the mood changes, the defensive behavior when questioned. How had I been so blind to what was happening in my own home? But perhaps more devastating than discovering Tyler's betrayal was realizing that Rebecca had been right about one thing. I hadn't been as sharp as I thought. Not because I was developing dementia, but because I'd been so desperate for family closeness that I'd overlooked clear warning signs that my grandson was not the person I believed him to be. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. Tyler wasn't just stealing from me, he was endangering my life every time he took my heart medication, and based on his phone conversation, he was also likely selling prescription drugs to other people, potentially contributing to the prescription drug abuse epidemic that was destroying communities across the country. I had evidence of everything, captured clearly on camera. But using that evidence would mean destroying any hope of maintaining the family relationships I'd tried so hard to preserve after Frank's death. It would mean admitting that the grandson I'd helped raise, the boy I'd sacrificed for and believed in, saw me as nothing more than a source of valuable drugs to steal and sell. As dawn broke over Cedar Falls, I knew my life had changed irrevocably. The safe, loving home I thought I'd created for my family was built on a foundation of lies and exploitation, and the hardest part was knowing that the person I'd trusted most had been systematically putting my life at risk for money. The hidden camera had caught everything, but now I faced the most difficult decision of my life: what to do with the truth it had revealed. The next morning arrived with an oppressive gray sky that seemed to mirror my emotional state. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through the implications of what I'd witnessed. Tyler came down for breakfast as if nothing had happened, cheerfully asking if I needed help with anything before school. The casual normalcy of his behavior after what I'd seen felt like another slap in the face. "Morning, Grandma Dot," he said, pouring himself a bowl of cereal. "You look tired. Is everything okay?" The audacity of his concern, given what he'd done the night before, made my stomach turn. But I forced myself to respond normally, knowing I needed time to figure out my next move. "Just didn't sleep well, sweetheart. You know how it is at my age." He nodded sympathetically, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the genuine caring I'd always believed was there. It made everything worse, knowing that somewhere beneath this calculating thief was still the boy I'd loved and raised. After Tyler left for school, I spent the morning reviewing the camera footage again, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood what I'd seen. But the evidence was crystal clear. I watched him steal my medications 3 more times that week, each theft carefully planned and executed with disturbing efficiency. The pattern became clear. Tyler would wait until I was either upstairs or out of the house, then systematically go through my medications. He seemed to know exactly which ones were most valuable, taking larger quantities of my pain medication and heart pills while leaving my diabetes medication mostly untouched. It was clear he'd researched the street value of different prescription drugs. Most disturbing was discovering that this had been going on far longer than I'd realized. When I scrolled back through weeks of footage, I found evidence of thefts dating back to shortly after the camera was installed. The pills I'd attributed to my own confusion or carelessness had been Tyler's doing all along. But the camera revealed more than just theft. On Friday afternoon, I watched Tyler bring a visitor into my house while I was at my weekly doctor's appointment. The boy looked to be about Tyler's age, thin and nervous, with the kind of restless energy I'd learned to associate with troubled teenagers. "This is where my grandma keeps all her stuff," Tyler said, leading the visitor directly to my medication counter. "See? It's like a pharmacy here. The old lady has no clue how much this stuff is worth." Hearing my grandson refer to me as the old lady with such casual disrespect was almost as painful as watching him steal from me. This wasn't just criminal behavior, it was a complete betrayal of the relationship I thought we'd built. The visitor, who Tyler called Danny, seemed impressed. "Damn, dude. This is a gold mine. How often can you get this stuff?" "Pretty much whenever," Tyler replied, pocketing several pills. "She takes so many she can't keep track. Plus, she's starting to get senile, so even if she notices, nobody believes her." The calculated cruelty of using my age against me, of deliberately undermining my credibility with my own daughter, revealed a level of manipulation I'd never imagined Tyler capable of. He wasn't just stealing my medications, he was systematically destroying my ability to report the theft. That weekend, I called my oldest son, James, who lived in Minneapolis. James had always been the responsible one, the child who'd become a successful accountant and maintained a stable marriage. If anyone could give me objective advice about this situation, it would be him. "Mom, are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" James asked, after I explained everything. "I mean, Tyler's always been such a good kid. Are you certain you're not misinterpreting something?" Even my own son questioned my perception of events. The doubt in his voice made me realize how effectively Tyler had positioned himself as the innocent victim of his grandmother's declining mental state. Everyone saw him as the helpful, devoted grandson, while viewing me as an aging woman whose judgment couldn't be trusted. "James, I have video evidence," I said firmly. "Multiple instances, clear as day. Your nephew is stealing my heart medication to sell on the street." The silence that followed was deafening. When James finally spoke, his voice was strained. "If what you're saying is true, Mom, this is bigger than just family drama. We're talking about serious criminal activity. What are you planning to do?" That was the question that had been keeping me awake at night. Reporting Tyler to the police would destroy any chance of maintaining family relationships. Rebecca would never forgive me for having her son arrested, and I'd lose the only family I had left in Cedar Falls. But allowing the theft to continue meant putting my health at risk and enabling Tyler's descent into criminal behavior. I decided to try one more approach before involving law enforcement. That Sunday, when Rebecca had a rare day off, I asked both her and Tyler to sit down for a family meeting. I'd prepared carefully, printing out screenshots from the camera footage and organizing my evidence. "I need to share something with both of you," I began, my heart pounding. "I've been losing medications for weeks now, and I decided to find out why." I placed the first screenshot on the table, a clear image of Tyler at my medication counter with pills in his hand. Rebecca's face went white while Tyler's expression shifted from confusion to panic to anger in rapid succession. "You've been spying on us?" Tyler demanded, his voice cracking. "How could you do that? Don't you trust your own family?" The immediate deflection to make me the villain in this situation was masterful manipulation. But I was prepared for it. "Tyler, you're selling my heart medication," I said quietly. "Medication I need to stay alive. I have recordings of you talking about street prices and meeting buyers." Rebecca grabbed the screenshot, studying it with desperate intensity. "There has to be an explanation," she said. "Tyler, tell her this isn't what it looks like." But Tyler's composure had cracked completely. The charming mask he'd worn for months slipped away, revealing the angry, desperate teenager beneath. "Fine," he shouted, jumping up from the table. "So what if I took a few pills? You have way more than you need anyway. Do you know how much money people pay for this stuff? I'm not hurting anyone." The casual admission of guilt was shocking, but his justification was even worse. In Tyler's mind, my medications were simply resources he was entitled to exploit. My health, my life, didn't factor into his calculations at all. Rebecca began crying, the full weight of the situation finally hitting her. "Tyler, how could you do this to your grandmother? She opened her home to us when we had nowhere else to go." "Yeah, and now she's acting like I'm some kind of criminal for taking advantage of an opportunity," Tyler shot back. "Half the kids at school are selling their parents' pills. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" I stood up, my voice shaking with anger. "Those heart pills could mean the difference between life and death for me. You've been stealing medication that keeps me alive so you can buy video games and expensive clothes." Tyler's response revealed just how far he'd fallen. "You're old anyway. How much longer were you planning to live? At least this way, the pills are doing someone some good instead of just keeping a useless old woman breathing." The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't just disrespect, it was active malice. Tyler didn't just see me as a source of drugs to steal, he saw my continued existence as an inconvenience to his criminal enterprise. Rebecca slapped Tyler across the face, her hand cracking against his cheek with surprising force. "Don't you ever speak to your grandmother like that again." But the damage was done. Tyler had revealed his true feelings about me, about my life, about the value he placed on family relationships. He stormed out of the house, shouting that we were both crazy and that he was done with this family. After he left, Rebecca and I sat in stunned silence. She kept apologizing, promising that she'd had no idea what Tyler was doing, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. The expensive items Tyler had been acquiring, the unexplained money, the behavioral changes, the signs had been there for anyone paying attention. "I should have known," Rebecca whispered. I was so focused on my own problems, on trying to get my life together, that I ignored what was happening right in front of me. Over the next few days, we tried to establish new rules and boundaries. I moved my medications to a locked box in my bedroom, and Rebecca promised to monitor Tyler more closely. But Tyler's reaction to being caught had shown his true character, and I knew the fundamental problem hadn't been addressed. The boy had no remorse for what he'd done to me. His anger wasn't about being caught, it was about losing access to his source of income. And his casual dismissal of my life as worthless revealed a level of callousness that couldn't be fixed with new rules or closer supervision. Tyler returned home 2 days later as if nothing had happened, but the dynamic in the house had changed permanently. He avoided me completely, communicating only through Rebecca when necessary. The helpful, affectionate grandson was gone, replaced by a sullen teenager who clearly resented my continued existence. But more troubling was the discovery that Tyler's criminal activity hadn't stopped. I found evidence that he'd been going through Rebecca's purse, looking for her anxiety medications. When confronted, he claimed he was just borrowing them, but the pattern was clear. Tyler saw any prescription drug in the house as fair game for theft. The situation escalated when Tyler brought friends over while Rebecca and I were at my doctor's appointment. When we returned, I found my kitchen in disarray, and several over-the-counter medications missing from my medicine cabinet. It was clear that Tyler had given his friends a tour of my pharmacy, as he'd called it, and they'd helped themselves to whatever they wanted. That night, I heard Tyler on the phone with someone, discussing new inventory and setting up meetings for later in the week. He was planning to expand his operation, using my home as a base for drug dealing activities that could bring serious legal consequences for all of us. Rebecca tried to address the situation by having another conversation with Tyler, but it quickly devolved into a screaming match. Tyler accused us of treating him like a criminal, while Rebecca pointed out that selling prescription drugs was in fact criminal behavior. "You want to call the cops on your own grandson?" Tyler shouted. "Fine, but remember that when you're sitting alone in this house with no family left, because if you do that, you'll never see me again, and Mom will never forgive you." The threat was clear. My choice was between my safety and my family relationships. Tyler was banking on my love for him and my fear of being alone to prevent me from taking action that would protect my health and stop his criminal behavior. But Tyler had miscalculated something important. His casual dismissal of my life, his complete lack of remorse, and his continued theft despite being caught, had fundamentally changed how I saw him. The grandson I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his drug-dealing operation. That evening, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I called the Cedar Falls Police Department and asked to speak with someone about prescription drug theft. The officer I spoke with, Detective Sarah Collins, listened patiently as I explained the situation. "Mrs. Hensley, I want you to know that what you're describing is unfortunately more common than you might think." Detective Collins said, "Prescription drug theft by family members is a growing problem, and it often involves vulnerable elderly people being victimized by relatives who have access to their homes." She explained that the theft of prescription medications was a serious felony, especially when it involved controlled substances like my pain medication and heart pills. The sale of those medications carried even more severe penalties, potentially including significant prison time for someone Tyler's age. "The video evidence you've described would be crucial in building a case," Detective Collins continued, "but I want you to understand that once we begin an investigation, this becomes a criminal matter. Your grandson could face charges that would follow him for the rest of his life." I spent another sleepless night weighing my options. On one hand, Tyler was still technically a minor, and involving the police would likely result in him entering the juvenile justice system. On the other hand, his behavior was escalating, and his complete lack of remorse suggested that the situation would only get worse without intervention. The decision became easier when I discovered that Tyler had been stealing medications from neighbors as well. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly widow who lived 3 houses down, mentioned that she'd been having trouble with her arthritis medication running out too quickly. When I delicately probed further, she admitted that Tyler had offered to help her with yard work several times recently, during which he would have had access to her house. Tyler wasn't just victimizing me, he was systematically targeting elderly people in our neighborhood, using his reputation as a helpful teenager to gain access to their homes and medications. This wasn't a family problem anymore. It was a community safety issue that required law enforcement intervention. The next morning, I called Detective Collins back and told her I was ready to proceed with filing a formal complaint. She arranged to come to my house that afternoon to review the evidence and take my statement. As I waited for the police to arrive, I felt a mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the family relationships that would likely be destroyed by my decision, but relief that I was finally taking action to protect myself and other potential victims in my community. Tyler had made his choice when he decided to steal medications that kept me alive. Now I am making mine. Detective Sarah Collins arrived at my house on a cold November afternoon, her unmarked sedan pulling quietly into my driveway. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes that immediately put me at ease. She carried herself with the confident professionalism of someone who'd handled difficult family situations before. "Mrs. Hensley, I appreciate you taking this step," she said as we settled in my living room. "I know this can't be easy, but you're doing the right thing for yourself, and potentially for other victims." I handed her the tablet containing the camera footage, my hands trembling slightly. Watching a police officer review evidence of my grandson's crimes felt surreal, like I was living someone else's nightmare. Detective Collins studied the videos carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about dates, times, and the specific medications involved. Her expression grew increasingly serious as she realized the scope of Tyler's operation. "Mrs. Hensley, what your grandson is doing constitutes multiple felonies," she explained. "The theft of controlled substances, particularly in these quantities, carries serious penalties. The fact that he's selling them makes this drug trafficking, which is even more severe." She paused the video on a clear shot of Tyler counting pills into small bags. "This level of organization suggests he's been doing this for quite some time. Do you have any idea how long this has been going on?" I thought back to all the times I'd questioned my own memory, all the pills I'd attributed to my own confusion. "Possibly months. Maybe even since he moved in with me." Detective Collins nodded grimly. "The good news is that we have excellent evidence. These videos clearly show the theft, and the audio captures him discussing sales. This is as solid a case as we could hope for." She explained the process moving forward. They would need to obtain search warrants for Tyler's room and belongings, looking for additional evidence of drug sales. They'd also investigate his known associates and potential buyers, which could lead to a broader investigation of prescription drug trafficking in our area. "I need to warn you," Detective Collins said gently, "once we execute these warrants, your grandson will likely be arrested. Given his age and the severity of the charges, he could be tried as an adult depending on the amount of drugs involved and his criminal history." The weight of that possibility settled over me like a heavy blanket. Despite everything Tyler had done, the thought of him facing adult criminal charges was devastating. But I also knew that his behavior was escalating, and that other people were at risk. "Detective, I need you to know that I suspect he's been stealing from other elderly people in the neighborhood as well," I said, sharing my conversation with Mrs. Peterson. Detective Collins made more notes. "We'll definitely investigate that. Targeting vulnerable elderly victims is an aggravating factor that prosecutors take very seriously." After she left, I sat alone in my house, wondering if I'd just destroyed what remained of my family. Rebecca was at work, unaware that police were now involved. Tyler was at school, probably planning his next theft or sale. The normalcy of their routines contrasted sharply with the storm that was about to hit our lives. I called Helen Kramer, needing someone to talk to who would understand the complexity of my emotions. Helen came over immediately, bringing tea and the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from years of dealing with family crises in her nursing career. "Dorothy, you did what you had to do," she said firmly. "That boy was putting your life at risk every time he stole your heart medication. And if he's targeting other elderly people in the neighborhood, he needs to be stopped." Helen's support meant everything to me, but I still felt the crushing weight of what was coming. In a few hours, Rebecca would come home to discover that her son was under criminal investigation. The family she'd been trying to rebuild after her divorce would be shattered again, this time by her own son's choices. Tyler arrived home from school around 3:30, his usual cheerful demeanor intact. He even asked if I needed help with anything, a gesture that felt particularly cruel given what I knew was coming. I managed to respond normally, but inside I was churning with anxiety about the inevitable confrontation. Rebecca came home at 6, exhausted from another double shift but in surprisingly good spirits. She'd been offered additional hours at the diner, which meant more money toward getting her own apartment. She chattered about her day while making dinner, unaware that her world was about to collapse. I waited until after dinner to tell them about my conversation with Detective Collins. The three of us were sitting at the kitchen table where I'd had so many important family discussions over the years, but none as devastating as this one. "I need to tell you both something," I began, my voice barely steady. "This afternoon I spoke with the police about the medication thefts." Tyler's fork clattered to his plate, his face draining of color. Rebecca stared at me in shock, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "You called the cops on me?" Tyler's voice was a mixture of disbelief and rage. "Your own grandson?" "Tyler, you've been stealing medication that keeps me alive," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "And you've shown no remorse whatsoever. You told me my life was worthless." Rebecca found her voice. "Mom, how could you do this without talking to me first? He's my son." The accusation in her tone stung, but I'd prepared for this reaction. "Rebecca, I did talk to you. Multiple times. You dismissed my concerns and suggested I was becoming senile." Meanwhile, Tyler was expanding his operation and potentially victimizing other elderly people in the neighborhood. Tyler stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. I'm not some kind of criminal mastermind. I took a few pills from someone who has way more than she needs." A few pills? I pulled out the printed screenshots Detective Collins had given me back. "Tyler, you've stolen hundreds of dollars worth of medications over the past few months. You've been selling them to other teenagers. You brought dealers into my house." The evidence was overwhelming, but Tyler continued to deflect. "Everyone's parents have prescription drugs lying around. This isn't a big deal unless you make it one." Rebecca was crying now, the full reality of the situation hitting her. "Tyler, the police are involved. This is serious. You could go to jail. Only if Grandma follows through with pressing charges," Tyler said, his tone shifting to manipulation. "She could drop this whole thing right now, if she wanted to. But apparently she cares more about a few pills than about her own family." The emotional blackmail was expertly delivered, designed to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. I could see Rebecca wavering, torn between her maternal instincts and the evidence of her son's crimes. "Tyler, I gave you multiple chances to stop," I said firmly. "You had no intention of stopping. In fact, you were planning to expand your operation." Tyler's mask slipped completely. "Fine, you want to destroy this family over some stupid pills. Go ahead. But don't expect me to forgive you for this, and don't expect Mom to choose you over her own son." He stormed out of the house, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows. Rebecca and I sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the confrontation settling over us. "Mom, is there any way to stop this now?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Could you tell the police you made a mistake?" Her question revealed that she still didn't fully understand the severity of what Tyler had done. In her mind, this was a family matter that could be resolved with forgiveness and better communication. "Rebecca, your son has been committing multiple felonies," I said gently. "He's been selling controlled substances, which means he's contributing to the prescription drug epidemic. And he's shown no remorse for putting my health at risk." Over the next hour, I walked Rebecca through all the evidence, the camera footage, the overheard phone conversations, the systematic nature of the thefts. Slowly she began to understand that this wasn't a teenage mistake, but a calculated criminal enterprise. "How did I miss this?" she asked, her voice breaking. How did I not see what my own son was becoming? I thought about her question carefully before answering. You've been working double shifts and dealing with your own struggles. Tyler's very good at manipulation, and he specifically used your trust against you. This isn't your fault, but even as I said it, I knew Rebecca would carry guilt about this for the rest of her life. The son she'd been trying to protect from the trauma of his parents' divorce had become someone she didn't recognize. Tyler returned home around midnight, trying to sneak in quietly through the back door. But I was awake, had been awake for hours, waiting. I heard him moving around upstairs, probably gathering belongings or hiding evidence. The next morning brought the inevitable knock on the door. Detective Collins arrived with 2 other officers and a search warrant for Tyler's room and belongings. Rebecca answered the door, her face pale and resigned. Mrs. Thompson, we have a warrant to search the premises. Detective Collins said professionally but kindly. We'll be as respectful as possible, but we need to examine your son's room and any common areas where evidence might be found. Tyler was still asleep when the police entered his room. I heard him wake up in confusion, then anger, as the officers explained what was happening. Within minutes, he was shouting about his rights and demanding to call a lawyer. The search revealed more than I'd expected. Hidden in Tyler's closet, officers found several small bags of pills, a digital scale, hundreds of dollars in cash, and a notebook containing what appeared to be customer names and contact information. Tyler hadn't just been stealing from me. He'd built a sophisticated drug dealing operation with multiple sources and regular customers. Most disturbing was the discovery of medications that clearly didn't come from my house. Pills with different pharmacy labels, different patient names, confirmed that Tyler had been systematically targeting elderly people throughout our neighborhood, and possibly beyond. Mrs. Hensley, this is significantly more serious than we initially thought, Detective Collins told me privately while her colleagues continued searching. The amount of drugs and the organized nature of this operation could result in very serious charges. Tyler was arrested that morning, handcuffed in my living room while Rebecca sobbed and begged the officers to reconsider. The image of my grandson being led away in handcuffs would haunt me forever, but I knew it was necessary to prevent him from victimizing more people. In the days that followed, the full scope of Tyler's crimes came to light. Police discovered that he'd been part of a larger network of teenagers stealing prescription drugs from elderly relatives and neighbors. His notebook contained names of at least 15 potential victims, most of them older adults living alone who'd trusted him enough to let him into their homes. Mrs. Peterson confirmed that Tyler had been stealing her arthritis medication for months, using his offers to help with yard work as opportunities to access her house. 2 other neighbors came forward with similar stories, having initially attributed missing medications to their own forgetfulness. The investigation revealed that Tyler had been selling drugs not just to teenagers but to adults with addiction problems, including several people in their 20s and 30s who were struggling with prescription drug dependence. His operation had been contributing to the broader opioid crisis that was devastating communities across the country. Rebecca struggled to process the revelation that her son had become someone she didn't recognize. The polite, helpful teenager she thought she knew had been a carefully constructed facade, hiding a calculating criminal who preyed on vulnerable elderly people. "I keep thinking about all the times he offered to help neighbors," she said, one evening, as we sat in the living room. "All those yard work jobs, all those offers to run errands. He was casing their houses, looking for opportunities to steal their medication." The legal process moved quickly. Tyler was charged as an adult due to the sophisticated nature of his operation and the vulnerability of his victims. The charges included multiple counts of prescription drug theft, drug trafficking, elder abuse, and operating a criminal enterprise. His court-appointed attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, arguing that Tyler was a minor who'd made poor choices under the influence of older criminals. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutor was determined to send a message about protecting elderly victims from prescription drug theft. Rebecca and I attended every court hearing, sitting together but feeling the weight of our family's destruction. Tyler refused to look at us, maintaining his anger and sense of victimization, even as the evidence of his crimes mounted. The most difficult moment came when Mrs. Peterson testified about how Tyler's thefts had affected her health. She'd been rationing her arthritis medication, trying to make it last longer, which had caused her significant pain and reduced mobility. Her testimony revealed the real-world consequences of Tyler's crimes. Elderly people suffering because a teenager saw their medications as a source of easy money. Tyler was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in juvenile detention followed by probation until his 21st birthday. The judge noted that while the sentence was severe, the systematic nature of Tyler's crimes and his complete lack of remorse warranted serious consequences. Rebecca and I left the courthouse that day knowing that our family would never be the same. Tyler would spend his remaining teenage years in detention, emerging as an adult with a criminal record that would follow him for life. The grandson I'd helped raise was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd seen my life as an obstacle to his criminal ambitions. But as difficult as the decision had been, I knew I'd done the right thing. Tyler's operation had been stopped before he could victimize more elderly people, and the investigation had led to arrests of other members of his drug-dealing network. The hidden camera had caught everything, but the truth it revealed had cost me the family relationships I'd treasured most. Sometimes protecting yourself and your community requires sacrifices that leave permanent scars on your heart. 6 months after Tyler's sentencing, Rebecca and I were still picking up the pieces of our shattered family. The house felt different now, emptier, but also safer. I no longer had to worry about my medications disappearing or strangers coming through my home under the guise of friendship. The locked medication box had been replaced by a simple pill organizer on my kitchen counter, a small symbol of the trust that had been restored in my own home. Rebecca had finally saved enough money to move into her own apartment across town, a modest one-bedroom place that represented her first step toward independence since her divorce. Our relationship had evolved through the trauma of Tyler's crimes, becoming more honest and equal than it had ever been when she was simply my daughter seeking refuge. "I used to think you were being overprotective," Rebecca admitted one evening as she packed the last of her belongings. "I thought your suspicions about Tyler were just signs of aging, maybe even paranoia. I dismissed your concerns because I didn't want to face the possibility that my son could do something so terrible." The guilt Rebecca carried was palpable, but I'd learned not to try to absolve her of it entirely. She needed to process her role in enabling Tyler's behavior, just as I'd had to process my own blindness to the warning signs. "You were dealing with your own trauma from the divorce," I reminded her. "Tyler was very skilled at manipulation. He convinced both of us that his behavior was normal teenage rebellion rather than criminal activity." Rebecca had started therapy after Tyler's arrest, working through her feelings of failure as a mother and trying to understand how she'd missed such obvious signs of her son's criminal behavior. The therapist had helped her recognize that Tyler's manipulation tactics were sophisticated and deliberate, designed to exploit her maternal instincts and her guilt about the divorce. Dr. Martinez says that children who commit these kinds of crimes often target the people who love them most, Rebecca shared. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push to avoid consequences. Tyler used my love for him as a weapon against both of us. The most difficult aspect of the aftermath was dealing with the community reaction. Word had spread quickly through Cedar Falls about Tyler's arrest and the drug-dealing operation he'd been running. Some neighbors were supportive, understanding that I'd had no choice but to report his crimes. Others viewed me as the grandmother who'd betrayed her own family. Mrs. Henderson from down the street actually confronted me at the grocery store, suggesting that I should have handled the situation within the family, rather than involving law enforcement. Her words stung, but they also revealed how little she understood about the severity of Tyler's crimes. "That boy was stealing medications that keep you alive," Helen Kramer had said when I shared Mrs. Henderson's comments. "Anyone who thinks you should have protected a drug dealer who was putting your life at risk doesn't understand the situation at all." Helen had become an even closer friend through this ordeal, providing the kind of unwavering support that helped me navigate the worst period of my life. She'd attended court hearings with me when Rebecca couldn't handle it, and she'd been there during the long evenings when I questioned every decision I'd made. Detective Collins had kept me informed about the broader investigation that Tyler's arrest had triggered. His notebook of contacts had led to the discovery of a prescription drug theft ring involving dozens of teenagers across 3 counties. Many of them were targeting elderly relatives and neighbors, using their access and trustworthiness to steal medications that were then sold through an organized network. Your grandson's arrest was the break we needed to uncover this entire operation, Detective Collins told me during a follow-up meeting. The network was much larger than we'd realized, and they were specifically targeting vulnerable elderly people who were less likely to report thefts or be believed when they did. 12 other teenagers were ultimately arrested as part of the investigation, along with several adult dealers who were purchasing the stolen medications. The operation had been generating thousands of dollars in monthly revenue while putting elderly victims at serious health risk. Most shocking was learning that Tyler hadn't been a low-level participant in this network. He'd been one of its most successful recruiters, teaching other teenagers how to identify and exploit elderly targets. His charming personality and genuine-seeming concern for older adults had made him particularly effective at gaining access to homes and medications. Your grandson was essentially training other kids to commit these crimes, Detective Collins explained. He'd developed a system for identifying elderly people who lived alone, had valuable medications, and were unlikely to immediately notice thefts. It was sophisticated criminal behavior disguised as teenage helpfulness. This revelation made Tyler's betrayal even more devastating. He hadn't just stolen from me, he'd used the relationship we'd built as a template for teaching other young criminals how to exploit elderly victims. Every genuine moment of affection I'd thought we'd shared had been contaminated by his calculating assessment of my vulnerabilities. Rebecca visited Tyler twice during his first months in juvenile detention. Both visits were traumatic experiences that left her emotionally drained for days afterward. Tyler remained defiant and unrepentant, insisting that his grandmother had overreacted and destroyed their family over a few pills. He still doesn't understand what he did wrong, Rebecca told me after the second visit. He keeps talking about how everyone's parents have prescription drugs and how it's not fair that he's being punished for something so many other kids are doing. He genuinely believes he's the victim in this situation. Tyler's complete lack of remorse was perhaps the most chilling aspect of his personality. Even faced with the consequences of his actions, even after hearing testimony about how his thefts had affected his victim's health, he remained convinced that he'd done nothing wrong. The empathy I'd thought I'd seen in him had apparently been another facade. Rebecca made the difficult decision to stop visiting Tyler altogether, after he spent an entire visit blaming me for his situation and demanding that she convince me to somehow reverse his conviction. His inability to accept responsibility for his choices, combined with his continued anger toward me, made it clear that he hadn't learned anything from the experience. I can't keep exposing myself to his manipulation, Rebecca explained. Dr. Martinez says that continuing to enable his victim mentality won't help him and is only causing me more trauma. Maybe some distance will force him to start taking responsibility for his choices. The decision to cut contact with Tyler was agonizing for Rebecca, but it marked an important step in her own healing process. She'd spent months blaming herself for his criminal behavior, wondering what she could have done differently as a mother. Stepping back from his manipulation allowed her to see more clearly that Tyler's choices were his own. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own complex emotions about Tyler's absence from our lives. Despite everything he'd done, I still grieved for the boy I'd thought I knew, the grandson who'd helped with yard work, listened to my stories about his grandfather, and seemed to genuinely care about my well-being. Understanding that this person had largely been a fabrication didn't make the grief any less real. Dr. Patricia Morrison, my longtime physician, had helped me work through the medical anxiety that resulted from Tyler's thefts. For months after his arrest, I'd been obsessive about monitoring my medication levels, checking and rechecking my pill counts multiple times per day. It's completely understandable that you develop anxiety about medication security after what you experienced, Dr. Morrison explained. Having someone steal medications that keep you alive is a profound violation of trust that affects your sense of safety in fundamental ways. She'd prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication to help me through the worst of the adjustment period, and she'd worked with me to develop new routines that helped me feel more secure about my medication management. The simple act of taking my pills had become associated with fear and vigilance rather than health and well-being. Gradually, with Dr. Morrison's help and my own determination, I was able to rebuild a sense of normalcy around my medical care. The locked medication box became unnecessary as I learned to trust that my home was safe again. The hypervigilance that had characterized the months immediately after Tyler's arrest slowly faded as I accepted that the threat was gone. One unexpected consequence of the entire ordeal was the way it strengthened my relationship with my son James in Minneapolis. He'd flown down for Tyler's sentencing, and we'd had the most honest conversations we'd shared in years about family, aging, and the complexities of loving people who aren't worthy of that love. "Mom, I owe you an apology," James said during his visit. "When you first told me about Tyler stealing your medications, I questioned whether you were remembering things correctly. I should have trusted your judgment and supported you from the beginning." James's acknowledgement meant more to me than he probably realized. His initial doubt had made me question my own perceptions during a time when I most needed to trust my instincts. Having him validate my experience helped heal some of the damage that Tyler's gaslighting had caused. "You weren't the only one who found it hard to believe," I assured him. Tyler was very convincing, and the idea that a 16-year-old could be running a sophisticated drug-dealing operation seemed far-fetched to everyone. James had stayed for a week after the sentencing, helping me process the emotional aftermath and making sure I had adequate support systems in place. He'd also helped me understand some of the broader social factors that had contributed to Tyler's criminal behavior, including the prescription drug epidemic that was affecting communities across the country. "What Tyler did to you was personal and terrible," James said, "but it was also part of a much larger problem. Prescription drug theft and abuse have become epidemic, and elderly people are often targeted because they're seen as easy victims who won't fight back effectively." This perspective helped me understand that Tyler's crimes weren't just a family tragedy. They were part of a broader social problem that required community-wide solutions. The isolation that many elderly people experience makes them particularly vulnerable to exploitation by people who appear trustworthy and helpful. As the first anniversary of Tyler's arrest approached, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed. The naive trust I'd once had in family relationships was gone forever, replaced by a more cautious, but perhaps more realistic understanding of human nature. I'd learned that love and trust aren't automatic entitlements, but must be earned and maintained through consistent actions. The hidden camera that had captured Tyler's crimes was long gone, but the lessons it had taught me remained. I'd learned to trust my own instincts, to value my safety and well-being above family harmony, and to recognize that protecting myself from exploitation wasn't selfish but necessary. Rebecca's move to her own apartment marked the end of an era in my life. For the first time in 3 years, I was living alone again, but it felt different than the loneliness I'd experienced after Frank's death. This solitude was chosen and empowering rather than imposed and isolating. "Are you sure you'll be okay living alone again?" Rebecca asked as she loaded the last box into her car. "I'll be fine," I assured her, and I meant it. I've learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely, and that sometimes being surrounded by the wrong people is more dangerous than being by yourself. The house felt peaceful that evening in a way it hadn't since Tyler had moved in. I made my dinner, took my medications without anxiety, and settled into my favorite chair to read. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was restful, free from the underlying tension that had characterized the past year. Helen came over the next evening to check on me, bringing homemade soup and her characteristic blend of practical wisdom and emotional support. "You look different," she observed, as we sat in my kitchen. "More relaxed. I think, like you're finally able to breathe freely in your own home again." She was right. The constant vigilance, the anxiety about my medications, the fear of what Tyler might do next, all of that was finally gone. I was 73 years old, living alone in the house where I'd raised my children, and I felt safer and more secure than I had in years. The story of Tyler's crimes had become something of a cautionary tale in Cedar Falls. shared among elderly residents as a warning about the importance of protecting themselves from prescription drug theft. Detective Collins had even asked me to speak at a community meeting about recognizing the warning signs of such crimes. Your willingness to come forward probably prevented other elderly people from being victimized, she told me. That takes tremendous courage, especially when the perpetrator is a family member. Speaking publicly about Tyler's crimes was difficult, but it felt important to help other elderly people understand that they didn't have to tolerate exploitation from family members. Too many older adults suffer in silence, afraid that reporting abuse or theft will leave them completely isolated from their families. As I concluded my remarks at the community meeting, I realized that Tyler's betrayal had ultimately taught me something valuable about my own strength and worth. At 73, I'd found the courage to protect myself from someone I loved, to prioritize my health and safety over family harmony, and to trust my own judgment even when others questioned it. The hidden camera had caught everything, revealing truths that were painful but necessary. Tyler's crimes had shattered my family, but they'd also freed me from relationships built on exploitation and manipulation. In the end, losing the grandson I thought I knew had allowed me to reclaim the self-respect and security I'd almost lost to his calculated betrayal. The boy I'd loved was gone, but the woman who'd survived his betrayal was stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. 2 years had passed since Tyler's sentencing, and I was beginning to understand that healing from betrayal isn't a destination but an ongoing journey. The initial shock and devastation had given way to a quieter kind of sadness, mixed with something I hadn't expected, relief that the truth was finally out in the open. My daily routines had settled into a comfortable rhythm. I'd joined a senior book club at the Cedar Falls Library, started volunteering at the local food bank, and even begun taking watercolor painting classes at the community center. These activities weren't just ways to fill time, they were deliberate choices to rebuild a life that felt meaningful beyond the drama that had consumed the previous years. The painting classes, in particular, had become a source of unexpected joy. I'd never considered myself artistic, but there was something therapeutic about mixing colors on a palette and watching scenes emerge on paper. My instructor, a patient woman named Carol Martinez, had encouraged me to paint from memory, and I found myself recreating scenes from happier times. Frank working in his garden, family picnics from when the children were young, the view from our bedroom window during Iowa's spectacular autumn seasons. Art can help us process experiences that are too complex for words, Carol had explained when I mentioned that painting seemed to calm the residual anxiety I still carried about family relationships. Sometimes we need to create something beautiful to balance out the painful things we've experienced. One afternoon, while working on a painting of the maple tree in my backyard, I received an unexpected phone call from Tyler's juvenile detention facility. The social worker, Ms. Angela Rodriguez, explained that Tyler was eligible for early release in 6 months, contingent on completing various rehabilitation programs and demonstrating genuine remorse for his crime. Tyler has asked specifically about making contact with you, Mrs. Hensley, Ms. Rodriguez explained. He's completed anger management and substance abuse programs, and he's expressed interest in participating in a restorative justice meeting if you're willing. The request caught me completely off guard. For 2 years, Tyler had maintained his stance that he was the victim of an overreaction to teenage mistakes. Rebecca had shared that during their brief correspondence, which had eventually stopped entirely, Tyler continued to blame me for destroying the family over a few pills. What exactly would a restorative justice meeting involve? I asked, my heart racing at the thought of seeing Tyler again. Ms. Rodriguez explained that restorative justice was a process where offenders met with their victims to discuss the impact of crimes and work toward understanding and healing. It would be facilitated by trained counselors and would only happen if I felt comfortable and safe participating. I want to be clear that this would be entirely voluntary on your part, she emphasized. Tyler's early release doesn't depend on your participation. This would purely be for the potential benefit of both parties in processing what happened. I asked for time to consider the request, and Ms. Rodriguez agreed to call back in a week. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Tyler had stolen medications that kept me alive, trying to process the possibility of facing him again. My first instinct was to decline. Tyler had shown no genuine remorse during his trial or the brief contacts with Rebecca. Why would he suddenly develop empathy now? More likely, this was another manipulation tactic designed to improve his chances of early release, or to somehow shift blame back onto me. But as I thought about it over the following days, I realized I had questions that only Tyler could answer. I wanted to understand how someone I'd loved and trusted could have viewed my life as so worthless. I wanted to know if the affection I'd believed we shared had been completely fabricated, or if there had been genuine feelings buried beneath his calculating exploitation. I called Rebecca to discuss Tyler's request. She'd been doing well in her own apartment, working steady hours at the diner, and taking evening classes toward a nursing degree. The distance from Tyler's situation had allowed her to build a life that wasn't defined by his choices. "I don't know if I'm ready to see him," Rebecca admitted when I explained the restorative justice opportunity. "I've been working so hard to accept that the son I thought I knew never really existed. Seeing him again might undo some of that progress." Her honesty helped clarify my own feelings. I realized that my desire to see Tyler wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about closure. I needed to look him in the eye as an adult and understand who he really was beneath the charming facade he'd maintained for so long. I called Miss Rodriguez back and agreed to participate in the restorative justice meeting, with specific conditions. I wanted Helen to accompany me for support. I wanted the meeting to be limited to 1 hour, and I wanted the right to end the session at any time if I felt uncomfortable. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late spring. I'd barely slept the night before, alternating between anxiety about seeing Tyler and determination to get the closure I needed. Helen picked me up early, bringing coffee and the kind of steady presence that had sustained me through the worst parts of this ordeal. The juvenile facility was more institutional than I'd expected, with concrete walls and security checkpoints that reminded me that Tyler was being held for serious crimes. Rodriguez met us in the lobby and explained the process once more before leading us to a small conference room with windows overlooking a courtyard. Tyler entered the room, accompanied by a different social worker, and I was shocked by how much he'd changed. He'd grown several inches and gained weight, but more striking was the change in his demeanor. The cocky confidence that had characterized his teenage years was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine nervousness. "Hello, Grandma," he said quietly, his voice deeper than I remembered. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to climb onto my lap to hear stories about his grandfather. Then I remembered the teenager who'd stolen my heart medication while telling buyers that I was just an old lady who wouldn't be missed. "Tyler," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Miss Rodriguez facilitated the conversation, explaining the ground rules and encouraging Tyler to share what he'd learned during his time in detention. Tyler began tentatively, speaking about the programs he'd completed and the counseling he'd received. "I want you to know that I understand now what I did to you was wrong," he said, looking directly at me for the first time. "I've spent 2 years learning about the effects of prescription drug abuse and how theft impacts victims. I know I put your life at risk." The words sounded sincere, but I'd heard Tyler deliver convincing performances before. I needed to understand if this was genuine insight or another manipulation. "Tyler, you told me my life was worthless," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "You said I was old anyway, and that my pills would do more good for other people. Do you remember saying that?" Tyler's composure cracked slightly, and for the first time I saw what looked like genuine shame in his expression. "I remember. I was angry about being caught, and I said terrible things that I didn't really mean." "Didn't you?" I pressed. "Because your actions suggested that you did see my life as worthless. You stole medications that keep me alive, not just once but systematically over months. You brought dealers into my home. You taught other teenagers how to exploit elderly people." The room fell silent, as Tyler struggled to respond. Miss Rodriguez gently encouraged him to take his time and be honest about his feelings and motivations. "I think I did see you as less important than other people," Tyler finally admitted, his voice barely audible. "Not because you were worthless, but because I convinced myself that you'd lived your life already, and that young people deserved more opportunities. The honesty was brutal but necessary. Tyler continued, explaining how he'd rationalized his crimes by creating a hierarchy of human value that placed elderly people at the bottom. He genuinely believed that stealing from me was less harmful than stealing from people his own age. The counselors here helped me understand that thinking was completely wrong, he said. Every person deserves to live without fear of being exploited by people they trust. I violated that in the worst possible way. As the conversation continued, Tyler revealed details about his criminal operation that hadn't come out during the investigation. He'd specifically targeted elderly people because research he'd done online suggested they were less likely to report thefts and more likely to be dismissed if they did. His friendly, helpful persona had been carefully crafted to gain access to homes and medications. "I studied your routines for weeks before I started taking your pills," he admitted. "I knew when you napped, when you went out, when you were most likely to be distracted. I planned everything to minimize the chance of getting caught." The premeditation was staggering. This hadn't been teenage impulsiveness but calculated predatory behavior. Tyler had assessed my vulnerabilities with the cold efficiency of an experienced criminal. But perhaps most devastating was learning about the broader network he'd been part of. Tyler had been recruited by older teenagers who'd taught him the techniques for identifying and exploiting elderly victims. He'd then recruited younger kids, creating a pipeline of prescription drug theft that had victimized dozens of elderly people across multiple counties. I told other kids that stealing from grandparents was easy money because old people couldn't fight back effectively. Tyler said, his voice thick with shame. I made it sound like we were outsmarting a system that didn't care about us anyway. Tyler had become something of a mentor figure in the juvenile drug dealing network, teaching newer recruits how to maintain facades of being helpful, caring teenagers while systematically stealing from the elderly people who trusted them. His success at victimizing me had made him a valuable asset to the broader criminal organization. "How many other elderly people did you steal from?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Tyler was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Directly? Probably 15 or 20, but if you count the people that kids I trained stole from, it could be over 100. The scope of victimization was overwhelming. Tyler's crimes against me had been just one part of a much larger operation that had put countless elderly people at risk. His charming personality and apparent trustworthiness had made him particularly effective at gaining access to vulnerable victims. "Do you understand now why I had to call the police?" I asked. "This wasn't just about a few pills between family members. You were part of an organization that was systematically exploiting elderly people." Tyler nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. "I understand, and I understand why you couldn't trust me to stop on my own. I'd shown you who I really was, and that person couldn't be trusted with your safety." For the first time in our conversation, I believed he was being completely honest. The Tyler sitting across from me seemed to genuinely understand the severity of what he'd done and the necessity of my response. The conversation shifted to Tyler's plans for life after detention. He'd completed his GED and was interested in pursuing addiction counseling as a career, hoping to work with teenagers who were heading down similar paths. He'd been accepted into a community college program that would allow him to study while living in a supervised halfway house. "I know I can't undo what I did to you or to the other people I victimized," Tyler said, "but I want to spend my life trying to prevent other kids from making the same choices I made." The meeting lasted the full hour, ending with Tyler asking if there was anything he could do to help me heal from what he'd done. I thought about his question carefully before answering. "Tyler, the best thing you can do is become someone worthy of the trust you violated," I said. "Don't just avoid making the same mistakes. Actively work to protect people from the kind of exploitation you engaged in." As Helen and I drove home from the facility, I felt emotionally drained, but oddly peaceful. Seeing Tyler again had been difficult, but it had provided the closure I'd been seeking. The grandson I'd loved was gone, but the young man I'd met seemed capable of genuine growth and redemption. "Do you think he was sincere?" Helen asked as we pulled into my driveway. "I think he was trying to be," I replied. Whether he can sustain that when he's released and facing real-world pressures remains to be seen. That evening, I called Rebecca to share what had happened during the meeting. She listened quietly as I described Tyler's admissions and apparent remorse. "I'm glad you got the answers you needed," she said when I finished. "But I'm not ready to have hope that he's really changed. I've been hurt too many times by believing he was someone he wasn't." Rebecca's caution was understandable. She'd invested more emotional energy in believing Tyler could change, and she'd been disappointed more often than I had. Her decision to maintain distance was self-protection that I respected. For myself, I found that seeing Tyler hadn't reopened old wounds as much as I'd feared. Instead, it had helped me understand that the person who'd victimized me was separate from the person he might become. I could acknowledge his apparent growth without forgetting the harm he'd caused, or trusting him with access to my life again. The restorative justice meeting had given me something I hadn't expected. A sense that Tyler's crimes, while inexcusable, hadn't been entirely senseless. His subsequent work to understand and prevent similar crimes suggested that some good might eventually come from the terrible experience we'd all endured. 6 months later, Tyler was released to the halfway house and began his community college program. I didn't maintain contact with him, but Ms. Rodriguez occasionally updated me on his progress. He was apparently doing well academically and had begun volunteering with an organization that educated elderly people about protecting themselves from prescription drug theft. Whether Tyler's apparent transformation was genuine or temporary remained to be seen. But for me, the journey toward healing was complete. I'd faced the person who'd betrayed me most deeply, understood his motivations, and confirmed that my decision to protect myself had been necessary and justified. The hidden camera had caught everything, revealing truths that shattered my family but ultimately set me free from relationships built on exploitation and deception. In the end, Tyler's betrayal had taught me something invaluable about my own worth and strength, lessons that no amount of family harmony could have provided. 3 years after the restorative justice meeting, my life had taken directions I never could have anticipated. The small watercolor painting I'd started as therapy had evolved into something approaching genuine artistic skill, and my work was now displayed in a local gallery's senior artist showcase. More surprisingly, I'd been invited to speak at conferences across the Midwest about elder abuse prevention and prescription drug theft awareness. The speaking engagements had begun modestly. Detective Collins had recommended me to present at a law enforcement training seminar about recognizing signs of prescription drug theft in elderly communities. Standing before a room of police officers and social workers, sharing the intimate details of Tyler's betrayal, had been terrifying but ultimately empowering. Mrs. Hensley's case illustrates how sophisticated these criminal operations can become. Detective Collins had introduced me. Her willingness to come forward despite family pressure prevented dozens of additional elderly victims from being exploited. That first presentation led to others. Senior centers wanted me to speak about protecting oneself from family members who might steal medications. Medical conferences invited me to discuss the health impacts of prescription theft on elderly patients. Victim advocacy groups asked me to share strategies for overcoming the guilt and isolation that often accompany elder abuse. Each speaking engagement taught me something new about the prevalence of crimes like Tyler's. I met other elderly people who'd been victimized by grandchildren, adult children, and even professional caregivers. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar. Manipulation, gaslighting, and exploitation of trust by people who were supposed to provide care and protection. One particularly powerful encounter occurred at a conference in Des Moines, where I met Margaret Walsh, a 78-year-old woman whose nephew had been stealing her Alzheimer's medication to sell. Unlike my situation, Margaret's family had convinced her not to report the theft, arguing that involving police would destroy family relationships. "I lived in fear for 2 years," Margaret told me after my presentation. "My nephew continued stealing my medications, and my memory problems got worse because I wasn't getting consistent treatment. When I tried to tell my daughter what was happening, she said I was confused and that my nephew would never do such a thing." Margaret's nephew had eventually overdosed on drugs he'd purchased with money from selling her medications. Only then did the family acknowledge what had been happening, but by that point, Margaret's cognitive decline had accelerated due to inconsistent medication access. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up about what happened to me," Margaret said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "I want other elderly people to know they don't have to protect family members who are harming them." These encounters reinforced my belief that reporting Tyler had been the right decision, even though it had cost me dearly in terms of family relationships. The alternative, allowing the abuse to continue, would have put not just me, but countless other elderly people at risk. Rebecca and I maintained regular contact, though our relationship remained different than it had been before. Tyler's crimes: she'd completed her nursing degree and was working at a rehabilitation facility, specializing in addiction treatment. Her work gave her insights into the prescription drug epidemic that helped her understand Tyler's crimes in a broader context. "I see teenagers like Tyler was every day," she told me during one of our monthly dinners. "Kids who started by stealing pills from family medicine cabinets and ended up with serious addiction problems. The difference is that most of them are victims of their own addiction, while Tyler was purely motivated by profit." Rebecca had chosen not to maintain any contact with Tyler after his release from detention. She'd heard through intermediaries that he was doing well in college and working with at-risk youth, but she wasn't ready to test whether his apparent transformation was genuine. "I spent too many years making excuses for his behavior and believing he could change," she explained. "Maybe he has changed, but I can't risk being manipulated again. I need to protect my own mental health." Her decision was wise, and I respected her need to maintain boundaries that protected her emotional well-being. Rebecca had built a successful career and stable life, and she wasn't obligated to jeopardize that progress for the possibility that Tyler had genuinely reformed. Helen Kramer remained my closest friend and strongest supporter. At 81, she was still sharp and energetic, though she'd developed some mobility issues that required her to use a walker. We'd established a routine of checking on each other daily, a mutual support system that ensured neither of us faced emergencies alone. "You've become something of a celebrity," Helen teased after reading an article about my latest speaking engagement in the Cedar Falls Gazette. Who would have thought that catching a drug dealer would lead to a second career as a public speaker? The media attention had been unexpected, but generally positive. Local newspapers had written features about my advocacy work, and I'd been interviewed for a documentary about elder abuse that was being produced by Iowa Public Television. The attention felt strange after decades of quiet anonymity, but it also felt purposeful. My health had remained stable, though I'd developed some new complications that came with advancing age. Dr. Morrison had added medications for managing blood pressure and cholesterol, but the anxiety I'd once felt about medication security was completely gone. I kept my pills in a simple organizer on the kitchen counter, trusting that my home was safe. The house itself had undergone some changes to accommodate my aging needs. James had visited the previous summer and installed grab bars in the bathroom, improved lighting throughout the house, and updated the security system. These modifications weren't responses to fear but practical adaptations that allowed me to maintain independence safely. One significant change was my decision to take in a boarder. Linda Patterson, a 68-year-old retired teacher, had responded to my advertisement for a housemate. She was recently divorced, looking for affordable housing, and interested in the companionship that sharing a home could provide. Linda occupied Tyler's former room, though I'd completely redecorated it to eliminate any reminders of his presence. She was quiet and respectful, contributing to household expenses and helping with tasks that were becoming more difficult for me to manage alone. Our arrangement was practical rather than emotional, but it provided security and companionship without the vulnerabilities that family relationships had created. "It's nice to have someone trustworthy in the house," I told Helen during one of our daily phone calls. "Linda keeps to herself mostly, but knowing she's there gives me peace of mind." The irony wasn't lost on me that I felt safer living with a relative stranger than I had with my own grandson. But Linda's presence in my home was based on clear agreements and mutual respect, rather than family obligations and assumed trust. During my 4th year of speaking engagements, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through the Victim Services Office. The envelope bore Tyler's name in the return address, though the handwriting was more mature than I remembered. I stared at it for several days before deciding to open it. The letter was lengthy and carefully written, clearly revised multiple times. Tyler wrote about his college studies, his volunteer work with at-risk youth, and his plans to pursue a master's degree in social work. But the bulk of the letter focused on his understanding of how his crimes had affected not just me but the broader community. "I've spent 5 years learning about the prescription drug epidemic and elder abuse," he wrote. "I understand now that what I did to you was part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that destroys families and communities. I wasn't just a kid making poor choices. I was a predator who targeted vulnerable people." Tyler described his work with teenagers who were beginning to experiment with prescription drug theft and abuse. He developed educational programs that helped young people understand the real-world consequences of these crimes, using his own experience as a cautionary tale. "I tell them about you," his letter continued. "I explain how I stole medication that kept my grandmother alive, how I brought dealers into her home, and how I taught other kids to exploit elderly people. I don't try to make myself sympathetic. I want them to understand that these crimes have real victims who suffer real harm." The letter included no requests for contact or forgiveness. Tyler simply wanted me to know that he was using his experience to prevent other families from enduring what ours had been through. He ended by acknowledging that he had no right to expect anything from me but hoped that his current work might provide some small measure of redemption for the irreparable harm he'd caused. I shared the letter with Helen and Rebecca, seeking their perspectives on Tyler's apparent continued growth. Helen was cautiously optimistic about his work, but warned against reading too much into a single letter. "People can write beautiful letters about change and growth," she observed. "The real test is whether they sustain that commitment when nobody's watching and it's not benefiting them directly." Rebecca's response was more skeptical. "Tyler was always good with words," she said. "He could make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe. I'd need to see years of consistent behavior before I'd trust that this transformation is real." Their reactions helped me process my own complex feelings about Tyler's letter. I was glad to hear that he was apparently working to prevent other families from experiencing what we'd endured. But I wasn't ready to interpret his efforts as evidence of fundamental character change. Instead, I chose to focus on my own continued growth and the positive impact my advocacy work was having. I'd received hundreds of letters from elderly people who'd heard my presentations or read articles about my experience. Many shared their own stories of family exploitation, and others described how my message had helped them recognize warning signs in their own situations. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a woman in Minnesota whose adult son had been stealing her diabetes medication to sell. She'd been afraid to report him because he was her only nearby family member. But hearing my story had given her the courage to contact the police. "Your strength in protecting yourself inspired me to protect myself," she wrote. "My son is now in treatment for addiction, and I'm managing my diabetes properly for the first time in years. Thank you for showing me that I deserve to be safe in my own home." These letters reminded me that my decision to speak publicly about Tyler's crimes was reaching people who needed to hear that they weren't alone, and that they deserved protection from exploitation, even when the perpetrators were family members. My 78th birthday marked 6 years since Tyler's arrest, and 4 years since our restorative justice meeting. Rebecca organized a small celebration with Helen, Linda, and a few friends from my book club and painting class. It was a quiet gathering that reflected the peaceful life I'd built after the chaos of Tyler's criminal period. As I looked around my living room at the people who'd chosen to be part of my life, friends rather than family members who assumed access, I reflected on how much had changed since Frank's death a decade earlier. The desperate loneliness that had made me vulnerable to Tyler's exploitation was gone, replaced by relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. "You've built a beautiful life," Rebecca observed as we cleaned up after the party. "I know losing Tyler was devastating, but you've created something meaningful from that experience." She was right. The speaking engagements, the advocacy work, the new friendships, and the sense of purpose I'd developed. None of it would have existed without the trauma of Tyler's betrayal. I wouldn't have chosen to endure that experience, but I was grateful for the strength and wisdom it had ultimately provided. That evening, I sat in my kitchen working on a watercolor painting of my backyard garden in autumn. The maple tree that Frank had planted 40 years earlier dominated the composition, its brilliant red leaves catching the late afternoon light. As I mixed colors on my palette, I thought about the hidden camera that had once been positioned above this same sink, capturing evidence of Tyler's crimes. The camera was long gone, but the lessons it had taught me remained. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to value my safety above family harmony, and to recognize that protecting myself from exploitation wasn't selfish but necessary. Most importantly, I'd discovered that surviving betrayal could lead to a life that was more authentic and purposeful than anything I'd known before. The painting was coming along nicely, the colors vibrant and true, like my life after Tyler's crimes. It was something beautiful created from difficult experiences, proof that even the most devastating betrayals couldn't destroy the human capacity for growth, healing, and hope. On a crisp October morning, exactly 7 years after I first discovered my medications going missing, I received a phone call that would bring my journey full circle. The caller identified herself as Dr. Maria Santos, director of the National Elder Protection Institute, a federal organization dedicated to combating crimes against elderly Americans. Mrs. Hensley, we've been following your advocacy work for several years, Dr. Santos explained. We'd like to invite you to serve on a national task force that's developing new policies to protect elderly people from prescription drug theft and family exploitation. The invitation was both flattering and daunting. The task force would meet quarterly in Washington, D.C., bringing together law enforcement officials, medical professionals, legal experts, and victim advocates to address what had become a nationwide epidemic of elder abuse. Your unique perspective as both a victim and an advocate would be invaluable, Dr. Santos continued. You've demonstrated that elderly people can overcome victimization and become powerful voices for change. We need that wisdom at the policy level. I accepted the invitation, though I insisted on bringing Helen as my companion for travel. At 82, she was still my closest friend and strongest supporter, and I couldn't imagine navigating Washington politics without her steady presence. Our first trip to the nation's capital was overwhelming. The federal building where we met was imposing, filled with serious people discussing complex legislation and policy initiatives. I felt out of place among the attorneys and academics, but Dr. Santos made it clear that my real-world experience was exactly what the task force needed. We can analyze statistics and study research all day, she told the assembled group during my introduction. But Mrs. Hensley can tell us what it actually feels like to be betrayed by a trusted family member, and what resources elderly victims need to protect themselves. The task force meetings revealed the staggering scope of prescription drug theft targeting elderly Americans. Our small-town experience in Cedar Falls was being replicated in communities across the country, with thousands of elderly people being victimized by family members, caregivers, and acquaintances who exploited their trust and vulnerability. The problem has reached epidemic proportions, explained Dr. Robert Kim, a researcher from the Centers for Disease Control. We estimate that over 1 million elderly Americans experience some form of prescription drug theft annually, with family members being the perpetrators in nearly 60% of cases. The statistics were sobering, but the personal stories shared during our meetings were even more impactful. I met elderly victims from across the country who'd endured experiences similar to mine: grandchildren stealing pain medications, adult children raiding medicine cabinets, supposed caregivers diverting prescriptions for profit. What struck me most was how many of these victims had been afraid to report the crimes because they didn't want to destroy family relationships or face the possibility of being placed in nursing homes by angry relatives. The fear of retaliation kept many elderly people silent about ongoing abuse. During our third meeting, I proposed establishing a confidential reporting system that would allow elderly victims to seek help without immediately triggering criminal investigations. The idea was to provide support and resources first, then allow victims to decide whether they wanted to pursue legal action. Many elderly people need time to process what's happening to them, I explained to the task force. They need to understand that they're not responsible for their family members' criminal behavior, and they need to know that protecting themselves doesn't make them bad grandparents or parents. The proposal generated significant discussion and ultimately became part of the task force's recommendations to Congress. The system would provide counseling, medical support, and legal guidance to elderly victims while respecting their autonomy to make decisions about how to proceed. Between task force meetings, my advocacy work continued to evolve. I'd been invited to co-author a book about elder abuse prevention with Dr. Patricia Chen, a gerontologist from the University of Iowa. The project required me to examine my experience with Tyler from academic and clinical perspectives, analyzing the warning signs I'd missed and the factors that had made me vulnerable to exploitation. Your story illustrates several key risk factors, Dr. Chen explained as we worked on the manuscript. Social isolation, after your husband's death, financial independence that made you an attractive target, and most importantly, your assumption that family relationships provided inherent safety. Writing the book forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about how my own loneliness and desire for family connection had blinded me to Tyler's manipulation. I'd wanted so desperately to believe in his affection that I'd ignored obvious warning signs and dismissed my own instincts. The most dangerous assumption elderly people make is that family members inherently deserve trust, I wrote in one chapter. Love and blood relationships don't automatically create trustworthiness. Trust must be earned through consistent, respectful behavior over time. The book, titled Hidden Betrayals: Protecting Yourself from Family Exploitation in Later Life, was published by a university press and became required reading in several social work and gerontology programs. More importantly, it reached elderly readers who recognized their own vulnerabilities in my story. Meanwhile, Rebecca had made a surprising decision. After 8 years of maintaining distance from Tyler, she'd agreed to meet with him as part of her own therapy process. Her counselor had suggested that seeing Tyler as an adult might help her resolve lingering questions about his apparent transformation. I need to know if he's genuinely changed or if this is just another long-term manipulation, Rebecca explained when she told me about her decision. I can't move forward completely until I understand who he really is now. The meeting took place at a neutral location, a coffee shop near the community college where Tyler was completing his master's degree in social work. Rebecca asked me not to attend, explaining that she needed to face him alone to trust her own judgment about his sincerity. If he's still the manipulative person he was as a teenager, I'll be able to tell, she said with a confidence that reminded me of the strong woman she'd become. And if he's genuinely changed, I need to see that for myself. Rebecca's meeting with Tyler lasted 3 hours, far longer than she'd anticipated. When she called me that evening, her voice was thoughtful rather than emotional. He's different, she said simply. Not perfect, not someone I'm ready to trust completely, but different. He talked about his work with at-risk kids, and I could tell he genuinely understands the harm he caused. Most importantly, he didn't ask for anything from me. No forgiveness, no relationship, no second chances. Tyler had shared details about his current life that demonstrated significant changes from his teenage years. He lived in a modest apartment, worked part-time while attending graduate school, and volunteered 20 hours per week with youth programs. His social media presence was minimal and focused entirely on his professional and volunteer work. He showed me letters from kids he's worked with, Rebecca continued. Teenagers who were heading down the same path he took, who changed direction after hearing his story. He's not just talking about redemption. He's actively working to prevent other families from going through what we did. Rebecca's assessment carried weight because she'd been Tyler's primary victim in terms of emotional manipulation. If anyone could detect false sincerity in his behavior, it would be her. Her cautious acknowledgement of his apparent growth was more meaningful than any letter or third-party report could have been. Does this change anything for you? I asked, genuinely curious about her plans. Not immediately, Rebecca replied. I'm glad he's apparently using his experience constructively, but I'm not ready to have him back in my life. Maybe someday, but not now. I've built something good without him, and I'm not willing to risk that progress. Her decision reflected the wisdom she'd gained through therapy and hard experience. Acknowledging Tyler's apparent growth didn't obligate her to resume a relationship with him. She could appreciate his current choices while protecting her own emotional well-being. For my part, Tyler's apparent continued rehabilitation provided a sense of closure I hadn't expected. While I had no plans to establish contact with him, knowing that he was using his experience to help other families avoid similar trauma felt like a form of cosmic justice. As my 80th birthday approached, I reflected on the decade that had passed since Frank's death set these events in motion. The naive, lonely widow who'd welcomed Tyler into her home no longer existed, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than I'd ever imagined I could become. My health remained relatively stable, though I'd developed some mobility issues that required occasional use of a walker. Linda Patterson had become more than a housemate. She was a genuine friend who provided practical support and companionship without the emotional complications that family relationships had created. The advocacy work continued to be fulfilling, though I'd begun to scale back my speaking engagements to focus on writing and policy work. The book had led to invitations to contribute to academic journals and policy papers, work that felt more sustainable for someone my age. Helen, now 85, had moved into an assisted living facility after a fall that convinced her she needed more support than I could provide. We still talked daily, and she attended important events in my life, but her decision to prioritize her safety over independence reminded me that aging required constant adaptation. On my birthday morning, I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and the newspaper, a routine I'd maintained for decades. The kitchen looked different now, brighter, more welcoming, free from the tension that had characterized it during Tyler's criminal period. My medications sat in their simple organizer on the counter, no longer objects of anxiety, but simply tools for maintaining my health. The mail that day brought an unexpected surprise. A card from Tyler. The envelope bore no return address, and the card inside was simple, a landscape watercolor that reminded me of my own painting hobby. The message was brief and respectful. Mrs. Hensley, I wanted you to know that I think of you often, and that my work helping families avoid the kind of trauma I caused continues every day. I hope you're well and at peace. With respect and gratitude for the courage you showed, Tyler. The card didn't ask for anything or suggest future contact. It was simply an acknowledgement of my birthday and an update on his continued work. I appreciated both the gesture and the boundaries it maintained. That evening, Rebecca, Linda, Helen, and several friends gathered for a quiet birthday celebration. As I looked around my living room at the people who'd chosen to be part of my life, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. You've created something beautiful from a terrible experience, Helen observed as we shared cake and memories. Tyler's betrayal could have destroyed you, but instead, it revealed strength you didn't know you had. She was right. The hidden camera had caught everything. Tyler's crimes, my vulnerability, and ultimately, my capacity for survival and growth. The truth it revealed had been devastating, but ultimately liberating, freeing me from relationships built on manipulation and creating space for authentic connections. As my guests left that evening, I returned to my kitchen to clean up. The same kitchen where Tyler had stolen medications that kept me alive now served as a gathering place for genuine friendships and meaningful relationships. The transformation felt symbolic of my larger journey from victim to survivor to advocate. I opened my laptop and began writing in the journal I'd maintained throughout this experience. The entry would capture not just the events of my birthday, but the reflection on how far I'd traveled from that terrified, confused elderly woman who'd first noticed her pills going missing. Today marks 10 years since Frank's death set these events in motion, I wrote. 7 years since Tyler's arrest, 4 years since our restorative justice meeting, and countless moments of growth, healing, and discovery in between. The grandmother who was too afraid to trust her own instincts about missing medications no longer exists. In her place is someone who knows her worth, trusts her judgment, and refuses to accept exploitation from anyone, regardless of family relationships. The journal entry continued for several pages, documenting not just my personal transformation, but the broader impact of speaking out about elder abuse. The letters from other victims, the policy changes influenced by our task force work, the book that was helping families recognize and prevent similar crimes. All of it had grown from the decision to install a hidden camera and face the truth it revealed. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a deep sense of completion. Tyler's crimes had shattered my family but ultimately revealed truths that needed to be confronted. His apparent rehabilitation provided hope that even the most devastating betrayals could lead to positive change, though I maintained realistic boundaries about what that meant for my own life. The hidden camera was long gone, but its legacy lived on in the strength it had helped me discover, the advocacy work it had inspired, and the protection it now provided to countless other elderly people who deserved safety in their own homes. Sometimes the most painful truths lead to the most meaningful transformations, and sometimes the greatest betrayals reveal the deepest reserves of courage we never knew we possessed. In the end, Tyler had stolen far more than my medications. He'd stolen my naive trust in family relationships and my assumption that love automatically creates safety. But in losing those illusions, I'd gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect myself, wise enough to recognize exploitation, and courageous enough to choose my own well-being over family harmony when necessary. The story that began with missing pills had become a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of creating meaning from even the most devastating experiences. That legacy would outlast us all. 2 months after my 80th birthday, I received news that would add another unexpected chapter to this long journey. Detective Collins, now promoted to lieutenant, called with information about a development in Tyler's case that had broader implications for the community. "Mrs. Hensley, we've been contacted by the FBI's Elder Justice Initiative," she explained. "Tyler's original case has become part of a federal investigation into prescription drug trafficking networks that specifically target elderly victims. They want to interview you about the organized nature of what Tyler was involved in." The federal investigation had uncovered connections between Tyler's teenage drug dealing network and larger criminal organizations that were systematically recruiting young people to steal from elderly relatives and neighbors. What had seemed like localized teenage crime was actually part of a sophisticated operation spanning multiple states. "The notebook Tyler kept with victim information has helped us identify patterns in other cases," Lieutenant Collins continued. His methods for targeting elderly people were being taught to teenagers across the Midwest. This wasn't just random criminal behavior. It was organized exploitation of vulnerable populations. The revelation that Tyler's crimes were part of a much larger conspiracy was both disturbing and validating. My decision to report him hadn't just stopped one teenager's criminal behavior. It had helped expose a network that was systematically victimizing elderly people across multiple communities. I agreed to meet with the federal investigators, though I insisted that Rebecca be informed about the development. Despite her decision to maintain distance from Tyler, she deserved to understand the true scope of what he'd been involved in during his teenage years. The FBI agents, Special Agent Jennifer Walsh and Special Agent David Kim, met with me at the federal building in Des Moines. They were professional and respectful, understanding that discussing these events was still emotionally difficult despite the years that had passed. "Mrs. Hensley, your grandson was more central to this network than we initially realized," Agent Walsh explained, showing me organizational charts that depicted the criminal hierarchy. "He wasn't just stealing and selling drugs, he was recruiting and training other teenagers to do the same thing." The charts revealed Tyler's position as what they termed a regional coordinator, responsible for identifying potential recruits and teaching them the techniques for exploiting elderly victims. His success at victimizing me and other elderly neighbors had made him valuable to the broader organization. "How many young people did he recruit?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Agent Kim consulted his notes before responding. "Based on the evidence we've gathered, Tyler directly recruited at least 23 teenagers across Iowa and Illinois. Many of those recruits then brought in additional participants. We estimate that the network he helped build victimized over 300 elderly people. The scope of victimization was staggering. Tyler's betrayal of our family had been just one small part of a criminal enterprise that had devastated hundreds of families and put countless elderly people at risk. The charming, helpful teenager who'd gained access to my medications had been a key figure in a predatory organization. The good news is that your decision to report Tyler in 2018 was the break that allowed us to begin unraveling this entire network. Agent Walsh added, many of the other victims were too afraid or too isolated to come forward. Your courage to speak up, despite family pressure, has led to justice for hundreds of other elderly people. The meeting lasted 3 hours, during which I provided detailed information about Tyler's methods, his recruitment techniques, and the way he'd used family relationships to gain access to victims. The agents were particularly interested in how he'd manipulated family dynamics to avoid consequences and discredit potential reports of theft. Tyler's case has become a template for understanding how these networks operate. Agent Kim explained. His techniques for gaining trust, identifying valuable medications, and avoiding detection are being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country. Driving home from Des Moines, I felt emotionally drained, but oddly proud. The decision I'd made 7 years earlier to install a hidden camera and face the truth about Tyler's crimes had ripple effects I'd never imagined. Hundreds of elderly victims would receive justice because I'd been willing to protect myself despite family pressure. That evening, I called Rebecca to share what I'd learned about the federal investigation. Her reaction was a mixture of shock and resignation. Shock at the scope of Tyler's criminal involvement, but resignation that confirmed her worst fears about who he'd really been as a teenager. I keep thinking about all the times he came home with money or expensive items, Rebecca said quietly. I convinced myself he was just good at his part-time job, but now I realize he was profiting from destroying other families. How many grandparents like you were hurt because of what my son was doing? The guilt in her voice was palpable, but I reminded her of what we'd both learned through therapy and hard experience. Rebecca, you were a single mother working double shifts and dealing with your own trauma from the divorce. Tyler deliberately concealed his criminal activities and manipulated everyone around him. You couldn't have known what he was hiding. Rebecca had built a successful life in the years since Tyler's arrest, but revelations like this one still triggered feelings of responsibility for his crimes. Her therapist had helped her understand that accepting Tyler's apparent current rehabilitation didn't require taking blame for his past behavior. The federal investigation continued for several more months, resulting in dozens of additional arrests and the dismantling of what prosecutors called one of the largest elder-targeted prescription drug trafficking networks in the region. Tyler's cooperation with authorities, providing information about the network's structure and operations, had been crucial to the investigation's success. His cooperation raised complex questions about redemption and justice. On one hand, Tyler was helping to bring justice to hundreds of elderly victims and prevent future crimes. On the other hand, his assistance was motivated partly by the desire to reduce his own legal exposure in the federal case. He's facing potential federal charges for racketeering and conspiracy, Lieutenant Collins explained during one of our updates. His cooperation might help him avoid additional prison time, but it's also genuinely helping us protect other elderly people. The complexity of Tyler's situation reflected broader questions about criminal justice and rehabilitation. Could someone who'd committed such calculating crimes against vulnerable people genuinely reform? Was cooperation with law enforcement evidence of true remorse, or simply strategic self-interest? I found myself less concerned with Tyler's motivations than with the practical results of his cooperation. If his information helped protect other elderly people from exploitation, that mattered more than whether his assistance was purely altruistic. During this same period, my work with the National Elder Protection Institute was reaching new levels of impact. Our task force's recommendations had been incorporated into federal legislation that increased penalties for prescription drug theft targeting elderly victims and provided funding for prevention programs. The Elder Security Act owes much to your advocacy and the real-world perspective you brought to our policy discussions. Dr. Santos told me during our final task force meeting, your willingness to share your experience publicly has influenced national policy in ways that academic research alone never could have achieved. The legislation included provisions for the confidential reporting system I'd proposed, specialized training for law enforcement officers investigating elder abuse, and funding for community education programs. Most importantly, it recognized prescription drug theft as a serious crime with severe consequences, rather than a family matter that should be handled privately. My book with Dr. Chen had also exceeded expectations, becoming a bestseller in the elder care field and generating invitations for additional writing projects. Publishers were interested in a follow-up book that would focus on the policy implications of elder abuse and the systemic changes needed to protect vulnerable populations. You've become the most recognizable voice in elder abuse advocacy, Dr. Chen observed during one of our planning meetings for the second book. Your story resonates with people because it shows that anyone can become a victim, but also that anyone can find the strength to protect themselves and help others. The recognition was gratifying, but also somewhat overwhelming. I'd never intended to become a public figure when I first installed that hidden camera in my kitchen. The transformation from isolated elderly victim to national advocate had happened gradually, driven by the belief that other people shouldn't have to endure what I'd experienced. My speaking engagements had evolved beyond simple victim testimony to include presentations on policy development, community prevention strategies, and the psychology of family exploitation. Universities invited me to lecture in criminal justice and social work programs, and I'd become a regular presenter at national conferences on aging and elder abuse. Your presentations have a unique impact because you speak from lived experience rather than academic theory, commented Dr. Sarah Williams, a criminologist who'd attended one of my university lectures. Students remember your story because it makes abstract concepts about vulnerability and exploitation feel real and personal. The academic recognition led to an unexpected honor. The University of Iowa offered me an honorary doctorate in recognition of my advocacy work and contributions to elder abuse prevention. The ceremony would take place in May, exactly 10 years after Tyler's initial arrest. It seems fitting that this recognition comes at the 10-year mark, Rebecca observed when I shared the news with her. You've spent a decade turning the worst experience of your life into something that helps protect other people. Rebecca had continued her own healing journey, recently completing additional certification in geriatric nursing that allowed her to specialize in working with elderly patients who'd experienced abuse or exploitation. Her professional work gave her insights into the long-term effects of crimes like Tyler's and reinforced her understanding of why I'd needed to report him. I see patients regularly who are dealing with the aftermath of family exploitation, she shared during one of our monthly dinners. The ones who report the crimes and get proper support recover much better than those who try to handle everything privately. You made the right choice, even though it cost us dearly as a family. Her validation meant everything to me. Rebecca's professional expertise in elder care gave weight to her assessment that reporting Tyler had been necessary, not just for my protection, but for my long-term recovery and well-being. The honorary doctorate ceremony was attended by Helen, Rebecca, Linda, and several friends from my various activities and advocacy work. As I walked across the stage to receive the degree, I thought about the frightened, confused elderly woman who'd first noticed her medications disappearing 7 years earlier. Dr. Dorothy Hensley, the university president announced as he handed me the diploma. In recognition of exceptional service to vulnerable populations and groundbreaking advocacy in the field of elder protection. The title felt surreal, but also deeply meaningful. I'd never attended college, let alone graduate school, but the life experience that had earned me this recognition was more valuable than any formal education could have been. During my acceptance speech, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 7 years ago, I was a lonely widow who trusted the wrong person and nearly paid for that trust with my life, I told the assembled graduates and their families. Today, I stand before you as someone who learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. And sometimes the most devastating betrayals can lead to the most meaningful contributions we ever make. The speech generated a standing ovation, but more importantly, it reached people who needed to hear the message. I received dozens of letters from graduates and family members who shared their own experiences with elder abuse or expressed gratitude for the awareness my story had provided. As I approached my 81st birthday, I began contemplating legacy in more concrete terms. My advocacy work had achieved more than I'd ever imagined possible, but I wanted to ensure that the impact would continue beyond my own lifetime. Working with attorneys and financial advisors, I established the Dorothy Hensley Foundation for Elder Protection, funded partly by proceeds from my book sales and speaking fees. The foundation would provide grants for research into elder abuse prevention, support for victims of family exploitation, and community education programs. Most importantly, it would continue the work I'd started, ensuring that elderly people understood they deserved protection from exploitation, regardless of who the perpetrators might be. This foundation represents the transformation of your pain into purpose, Helen observed as we reviewed the final legal documents. Tyler's crimes will ultimately protect countless other elderly people through the work this organization will do. The irony wasn't lost on me that Tyler's betrayal had set in motion events that would help protect generations of elderly people from similar crimes. The hidden camera that caught his theft had revealed not just his individual crimes, but systemic vulnerabilities that needed addressing through policy, education, and community support. As I signed the foundation documents, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that began with missing pills and a hidden camera had evolved into something far larger than personal healing. It had become a legacy of protection for vulnerable people everywhere. The final signature on the foundation paperwork felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Tyler's betrayal would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined the limits of what that story could accomplish. 6 months after establishing the foundation, I received an invitation that would challenge me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The International Conference on Elder Rights in Geneva, Switzerland, had requested that I deliver the keynote address about family exploitation and systemic prevention strategies. At 81, the prospect of international travel was daunting, but the opportunity to influence global policy on elder protection was too significant to decline. "You've become an international symbol of elder empowerment," explained Dr. Margaret Thornton, the conference organizer, during our video call. "Countries around the world are struggling with rising rates of elder abuse, particularly prescription drug theft by family members. Your experience and advocacy work offer a roadmap for addressing these crimes systematically rather than treating them as isolated family problems." The preparation for the Geneva speech required extensive research into international approaches to elder protection. I discovered that prescription drug theft targeting elderly people was a global phenomenon, with particularly severe problems in countries where aging populations lived in multi-generational households that provided easy access for potential thieves. Working with translators and cultural consultants, I adapted my presentation to address diverse international audiences, while maintaining the personal authenticity that made my message compelling. The speech would be simultaneously translated into 12 languages and broadcast to elder care professionals worldwide. Linda Patterson proved invaluable during the preparation period, helping me organize research materials and practice the presentation. Our friendship had deepened over the years, evolving from a practical housing arrangement into genuine companionship based on mutual respect and shared interests. "You're nervous about this speech in a way I've never seen before," Linda observed as we reviewed the presentation slides one evening. "What's different about this one?" Her question made me reflect on why the Geneva speech felt more significant than the hundreds of presentations I'd given over the years. "I think it's because this isn't just about sharing my story anymore," I replied. "I'm being asked to propose solutions for a global problem. The responsibility feels enormous." The flight to Geneva was my first international trip since a trip to Europe with Frank 30 years earlier. Helen, despite her advancing age and mobility challenges, insisted on accompanying me, viewing the journey as an adventure that would crown our decade-long friendship. "I've watched you grow from a frightened victim into an international advocate," Helen said as our plane lifted off from Chicago. "I wouldn't miss seeing you address world leaders about protecting elderly people everywhere." Geneva was magnificent, with its pristine lakefront and impressive international buildings. The conference venue, the World Health Organization headquarters, was filled with delegates from 53 countries, all focused on developing coordinated responses to the global epidemic of elder abuse. My keynote address was scheduled for the second day of the conference, following presentations by ministers of health, academic researchers, and international legal experts. Standing backstage, waiting to address this distinguished audience, I thought about the hidden camera that had started this entire journey 8 years earlier. The speech itself felt like an out-of-body experience. Speaking to delegates from countries I'd only read about, sharing the intimate details of Tyler's betrayal with people whose cultures and languages differed vastly from my own, I felt the universal nature of the problems we were addressing. Elder abuse transcends national boundaries, economic systems, and cultural differences, I told the assembled delegates. Whether we're discussing prescription drug theft in rural Iowa or financial exploitation in urban Tokyo, the fundamental dynamics remain the same: vulnerable people being victimized by those they trust most. The presentation included specific policy recommendations based on the American experience with the Elder Security Act, adapted for international implementation. I emphasized the importance of treating elder abuse as a criminal justice issue rather than a private family matter, and the need for victim support systems that prioritized elderly people's autonomy and safety. The most dangerous myth about elder abuse is that families can handle these problems internally, I continued. This assumption allows criminal behavior to continue while isolating victims from the support and protection they deserve. Every country represented here needs legal frameworks that empower elderly people to protect themselves without fear of family retaliation. The response was overwhelming. Delegates from countries as diverse as Japan, Kenya, and Brazil approached me afterward to discuss adapting my recommendations to their specific contexts. Many shared stories remarkably similar to my own experience with Tyler, confirming that family exploitation of elderly people was indeed a universal problem, requiring coordinated international responses. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Japan's Minister of Aging Affairs, was particularly interested in the confidential reporting system we'd developed in the United States. Our elderly population faces significant prescription drug theft, but cultural expectations about family loyalty make reporting these crimes extremely difficult, she explained. Your model of providing support before requiring legal action could work well in our context. The conference led to my appointment as a consultant to the United Nations Commission on Population and Development, specifically focusing on protection strategies for aging populations. The role would involve quarterly meetings in New York and collaboration with international experts on developing global standards for elder protection. You've gone from small-town victim to international policymaker in less than a decade, Helen marveled as we flew home from Geneva. Frank would be so proud of what you've accomplished. The mention of Frank brought tears to my eyes. He'd been gone for 11 years now, and while the grief had softened, I still missed his steady presence and practical wisdom. I often wondered what he would think of the woman I'd become after Tyler's betrayal forced me to discover strength I'd never known I possessed. Returning to Cedar Falls after the international recognition felt grounding. My house, my neighborhood, my daily routines. All of it reminded me that despite the global scope of my advocacy work, my roots remained in the small Iowa community where this journey had begun. The local newspaper, the Cedar Falls Gazette, ran a front-page story about my Geneva speech and UN appointment. The attention was gratifying but also slightly uncomfortable, as I'd never sought fame or recognition for its own sake. What mattered was the practical impact on protecting elderly people from exploitation. One unexpected consequence of the international attention was renewed media interest in Tyler's current life and apparent rehabilitation. A journalist from the Des Moines Register contacted me about writing a follow-up story examining how both Tyler and I had evolved since his crimes nearly a decade earlier. People are curious about whether genuine redemption is possible after such serious crimes, the journalist Marcus Williams explained during our initial conversation. Your story suggests that both victims and perpetrators can transform themselves, but readers want to understand what that really looks like in practice. I agreed to the interview with specific conditions. I would speak about my own journey and the broader implications of Tyler's crimes, but I wouldn't speculate about his current sincerity or make predictions about his future behavior. That remained his responsibility to demonstrate through consistent actions over time. The interview process was more intensive than I'd expected, involving multiple sessions where Marcus explored not just the facts of Tyler's crimes, but the emotional and psychological impact of family betrayal. He was particularly interested in how I'd maintained hope and purpose, despite such a devastating violation of trust. Many people who experience similar betrayals become bitter or withdraw from family relationships entirely, Marcus observed. You've somehow managed to transform the experience into something positive without losing your capacity for love and connection. How did you achieve that balance? The question forced me to examine my own psychological journey more deeply than I'd done before. I think the key was separating Tyler's actions from my own worth, I reflected. His crimes said nothing about my value as a person or my capacity to build meaningful relationships. They only revealed his choices and character at that time. The article titled From Betrayal to Global Advocacy: How One Grandmother's Courage Changed International Elder Protection was published as a Sunday feature and generated significant response. Readers wrote letters sharing their own experiences with family exploitation, and several thanked me for demonstrating that elderly people could overcome victimization and create meaningful lives afterward. One letter particularly moved me. It came from Sarah Mitchell, a 70-year-old woman in California whose son had been stealing her arthritis medication for 2 years. She'd read my story and found the courage to report the theft, leading to her son's arrest and her own recovery from the chronic pain that had worsened due to inconsistent medication access. Your example showed me that protecting myself wasn't betraying my son, it was refusing to enable his criminal behavior, Sarah wrote. He's now in treatment for addiction, and our relationship is slowly healing based on honesty rather than manipulation. Thank you for showing me that love sometimes requires difficult choices. Letters like Sarah's reminded me why the advocacy work remained important despite the personal cost. Every person who found the courage to protect themselves from family exploitation validated the difficult decisions I'd made during my own crisis. The UN work proved to be fascinating and challenging. Monthly video conferences with commissioners from around the world exposed me to perspectives on aging and elder protection that differed dramatically from American approaches. Some countries emphasized family-based care systems, while others prioritized institutional support for elderly people. The American model of individual empowerment works well in cultures that value personal autonomy, observed Dr. Fatima al-Rashid, a commissioner from Jordan. But in societies where family hierarchy is more rigid, we need different strategies for protecting elderly people while respecting cultural values. These discussions broadened my understanding of elder abuse beyond the narrow framework of my own experience. While the fundamental dynamics of exploitation remained consistent across cultures, the solutions needed to be adapted to local contexts and values. My work with the UN led to invitations to consult on elder protection initiatives in countries I'd never imagined visiting. A trip to New Zealand involved meetings with Maori elders about protecting Indigenous aging populations from exploitation, with Canadian officials focused on addressing elder abuse in remote rural communities where law enforcement resources were limited. Each international experience reinforced my belief that Tyler's crimes, while personally devastating, had ultimately served a larger purpose by forcing attention to systemic vulnerabilities that affected elderly people worldwide. The hidden camera that caught his theft had become a lens for examining global patterns of elder exploitation. Meanwhile, Rebecca had made another significant decision in her own healing journey. After 3 years of maintaining professional distance from Tyler, she'd accepted his invitation to attend his graduate school graduation ceremony. Tyler was completing his master's degree in social work with a specialization in addiction counseling and family intervention. I need to see who he's become, Rebecca explained when she told me about her decision. Not because I'm ready to resume a relationship, but because I need closure about whether his apparent transformation is genuine or just another long-term manipulation. I supported her decision while encouraging her to maintain the emotional boundaries she'd worked so hard to establish. Rebecca had built a successful career and stable life, and she couldn't afford to jeopardize that progress based on hope that Tyler had genuinely changed. The graduation ceremony took place at Iowa State University, where Tyler had completed his undergraduate degree before transferring to the social work program. Rebecca attended alone, having decided that this moment of evaluation needed to be entirely her own without influence from other family members. Her report afterward was cautiously positive. "He seems genuinely committed to the work he's doing," she told me during our phone conversation that evening. "He introduced me to his professors and supervisors, and they spoke highly of his dedication to helping families affected by addiction and abuse. Most importantly, he didn't ask for anything from me. No forgiveness, no resumed relationship, just acknowledgement of the work he's doing." Tyler had apparently built a life focused entirely on professional service and personal growth. He lived modestly, worked extensively with at-risk youth, and had maintained the same romantic relationship for over 2 years. The longest stable relationship of his adult life. His girlfriend, Amanda, works in child protective services, Rebecca continued. "She knows everything about his past, including what he did to you. The fact that someone in her profession would trust him enough to build a relationship suggests he's genuinely changed, at least to some degree." Rebecca's assessment carried weight because she'd been Tyler's primary victim in terms of emotional manipulation. Her cautious acknowledgement of his apparent growth was more meaningful than any external evaluation could have been. "Does this change your plans for future contact?" I asked, genuinely curious about her intentions. "Not immediately," Rebecca replied. "I'm glad he's apparently using his experience constructively, but I'm still not ready to have him in my life regularly. Maybe someday. But not now. I've learned that acknowledging someone's growth doesn't obligate me to expose myself to potential manipulation again." Her wisdom reflected the healthy boundaries she'd developed through therapy and hard experience. Rebecca had learned to separate Tyler's apparent rehabilitation from her own need for emotional safety, a distinction that protected her while acknowledging the possibility of genuine change. As I entered my 82nd year, the pace of my advocacy work had necessarily slowed, but the impact continued to expand. The Dorothy Hensley Foundation had funded research projects in 7 countries, supported hundreds of elderly abuse victims, and influenced policy development in multiple jurisdictions. The Foundation's most significant achievement was funding development of an international database that tracked patterns of elder abuse across borders, helping law enforcement agencies identify organized criminal networks that specifically targeted elderly victims. The database had already led to arrests in 12 countries and had prevented countless additional crimes. "Your foundation has become the gold standard for elder protection advocacy," Dr. Santos from the National Elder Protection Institute told me during our annual review meeting. "The research you've funded and the awareness you've generated have saved more elderly lives than we'll ever be able to count accurately." The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most was knowing that Tyler's crimes had ultimately led to protection for countless other elderly people. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed my faith and family relationships had become the catalyst for a global movement to protect vulnerable aging populations. Helen, now 87 and dealing with increasing health challenges, remained my closest friend and strongest supporter. Her presence at foundation meetings and advocacy events provided continuity and grounding that helped me maintain perspective on the work's importance. "You've created something beautiful from the ugliest experience imaginable," Helen reflected during one of our weekly lunches. "Tyler's theft of your medications led to protecting elderly people around the world. That's the kind of legacy most people only dream of creating." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not just for their kindness but for their truth. The hidden camera that had caught Tyler's crimes had ultimately illuminated a path toward protecting millions of elderly people from similar exploitation. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals reveal opportunities for the most meaningful contributions we could ever make to the world. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.